animals, plants, fungi, biodiversity offers a treasure trove of chemicals and compounds, some of which can be used to treat diseases from malaria to cancer, but more and more species are being threatened with extinction. Is that jeopardizing our health?
Pre-100,000 years ago, many more terrestrial species roamed the planet than they do today. But this has changed since the advent of human populations. For example, an estimated 85% of wild mammals have gone extinct over the course of the last 100,000 years, most of which occurred during a period known as the Quaternary megafauna extinction, between 50,000 and 10,000 years ago, with a mere global human population of around 5 million people. So contrary to popular belief, biodiversity loss is not a new thing. But where are we now with it? Are human populations continuing to slash biodiversity numbers? Or do some conservation efforts and policy changes give us reason to believe that this century might be different? Called by the UN the strongest natural defence against climate change, biodiversity's importance can't be underestimated, but our impacts on it, as we've just seen, is nothing new. Our greatest insight into the current state of biodiversity is the Living Planet Index, created by the World Wildlife Fund every 2 years. But although it's an incredibly useful resource which we'll get into, I'll first explore the report's shortcomings, as I believe it's a crucial part of understanding the current state of biodiversity. What do these 3 articles have in common? Well, they are all misleading, for the most part wrong. For example, it is true that there has been an average decline of 69% across the 30,000 species studied, but an average doesn't tell the whole story, and reducing the entire state of biodiversity into one figure has its own problems, as almost half of the animals in the 2022 survey have actually increased. For example, 50% of reptiles increased, 47% of mammals increased, and so did 45% of fishes. There are also other issues with using an average. For example, the 69% statistic gives the impression that all species are declining. But let's say hypothetically, if elephants are declining by 96% in India, but are increasing by 50% in Africa, looking at the average could pull us further away from a useful policy decision, as we might miss useful lessons from where populations have increased, or where we can allocate more resources if species are declining. So an understanding of local populations really matters when it comes to biodiversity. But I know what you might be thinking at this point. Even if those news articles might be wrong, and not helpful for policy decisions, what about the rapid decline in average species abundance anyway? This also shouldn't go unnoticed and is on the whole a bleak picture. For example, Latin America, the most biodiverse region on the planet, has an average decline of 94%. Africa has shown a decline of 66%, and Asia and the Pacific 55%, and more generally, freshwater species by 83%. The Director General of the WWF said in the report, "Our society is at the most important fork in its history and is facing its deepest systems change challenge around what is perhaps the most existential of all our relationships, the one with nature." The last 100,000 years then have been devastating for global biodiversity, but recent recoveries in Europe give hope that this century could be different. To start, the Wildlife Comeback Report commissioned by Rewilding Europe in 2022 gives us a great insight into around 10% of mammalian species that have recovered in Europe. The Eurasian beaver, for example, has gone from numbering in the thousands in the early 20th century to now recording a population size of around 1.2 million across the continent. And the European bison, which by the 20th century had gone completely extinct in the wild, have now returned to 10,000. And numerous other mammals like the grey seal, the Eurasian lynx, the wild boar and the red deer have all made impressive comebacks. But how did Europe create these impressive comebacks? The answer is fairly simple. Stopping the activities that were causing biodiversity loss in the first place, like hunting and habitat destruction, mostly due to agricultural expansion. Sweden, for example, introduced hunting limits on brown bears, as well as a financial reward scheme for the reproduction of wolverines. And Europe more widely has banned the hunting of harbour seals and reintroduced the Eurasian beaver to more than 25 countries across Eurasia. This all seems like progress surely, but there are some who wouldn't see this quite as positively, like the London School of Economics Grantham Institute, who argue that the losses in the Northern Hemisphere are less severe because most of the biodiversity decline had already happened between the 17th and the 19th century, citing the UK as one of the most biodiversity depleted countries in the world. These are definitely reasonable arguments, and it's also true that these 50 species measured in Europe alone is a tiny fraction of the world's biodiversity. But nevertheless, I'm going to make the judgment that the European rewilding effort is worthy of attention and praise, as it's a marker of what can be achieved in a very short space of time, if the right policies and protections are put in place. So protection policies might work to some degree then. But the elephant in the room is that there are projected to be 10 billion people inhabiting the Earth by 2050, and the main cause of biodiversity loss is food production. So is there an irreconcilable tension between feeding a world which in 2022 had 2.4 billion people who were food insecure, and trying to prevent a sixth mass extinction? Not necessarily. A 2021 report by the London-based think tank Chatham House gives 3 suggestions for how food systems can protect biodiversity, namely dietary change, setting aside land for nature, and changing our farming methods. On the dietary change front, every piece of food produced has a footprint. For example, how much water has it used, how much land has it taken up, and what has its impact on biodiversity been? Along these metrics, plant-based foods tend to have very low footprints compared to animal-based foods, like beef for example, which was responsible for 41% of tropical deforestation between 2010 and 2014. And then there is setting aside land for nature. Even nature-friendly methods of farming often encroach on habitats, so a potential solution is to leave entire areas of land just for ecosystem restoration and protection. And the final solution proposed is a fairly rapid change to farming practices, like substituting chemical and synthetic inputs for more ecological processes to manage soil fertility, supporting natural pollination and pest control, and moving to farming methods that work with nature, not against it. But this would have to be coupled with the efficiencies of dietary change, as in general, organic farming methods are 34% less effective than intensive farming, so wouldn't solve the problem on its own. Overall then, biodiversity is in rapid decline, but there are ways in which this could change. Whether it will or not though, is uncertain.